Hello, friends, and welcome to the third episode of season 2 of the Paleo Post Podcast. We're going to have a lot of fun this season and are hoping to bring that fun and enthusiasm through the airwaves to you. If you want to learn about the paleo world from where our ancestors originated, stay up to date on news and books, and just have a jolly old time, stay tuned. Be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and follow along because your Paleo Post Podcast is not only incoming, it is here. Hello, Dr. George Nash. How are you? Well, it's kind of morning for me, but it's evening for you. How are you doing?
I'm okay, Seth. How are you doing? I hope everything's okay there. We just started to get a bit of sunshine in our lives with the good weather, but for how long I do not know. We're still in the snow season, but today's been nice. It's been rather nice, yes.
I definitely understand that because where I am in Central California, we've been experiencing, I'm trying to remember what they call it,
Is it El Nino you're thinking about?
no, it's not El Nino because it's shorter. It's a one event, it's a one storm, but it's called something river, atmospheric river is what they call it.
Yeah.
So there's been this huge front that's been coming in from the north, and it has just been. I mean, in one day it rained 6 inches where my parents are, which California has been in a huge drought the last few decades.
Yeah.
And our reservoirs are almost, if I'm not mistaken, back to good levels at this point, just from these last few storms, which great for the land, bad for driving. I didn't do so well driving the other day in the rain, and I have to deal with those consequences. But besides that, I'm doing good. I got good news about, I don't know if I've really mentioned it to our listeners, but I am expecting. I am a father to be soon, and we just had our appointment where they do the ultrasound, where they look at the anatomy of the uh, baby to see if everything's okay, and everything looked great. So really happy about that. And I am just so happy to be back here and recording another episode of this podcast because truly I just miss talking about anthropology. I do not get enough of it. And I mean, I'm in school full time for anthropology, but I still don't get enough. It's just not enough, George. It's not enough.
I'm gonna have to feed you with more anthropology, I'm afraid, Seth. So grip the table, grip the table.
I will. I will be sure to. Um, So, today, guys, we have a really exciting episode. We've got some news, some cool stories to talk about, some exciting sites, and just some cool things that have been going on in the field. We're going to talk about it all. We're going to take some deep dives and we're going to have some fun. So just follow along. I will have links to each story in the description as well as any other relevant content that you might be interested in. So be sure to check out the description either before, during, or after the video. And be sure to give a thumbs up and give a rating if you're listening to on Apple Podcasts because it really helps us out. The more we get positive interaction with the public, the more our science communication gets to reach the public, and we get to teach and educate in a true way instead of people getting their news from who knows where. So, people like Dr. Nash and we want to make sure people get the real information about our prehistory. And that's what we're here to do today. So, to start out, we are going to be listening to uh, George about some cultures in Ice Age Europe, these distinct regional cultures. And why don't you start us off with that and tell us what we're talking about and the period we're in?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. It came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and I think you sent me the link about it. And it's a pretty obvious thing, really. But really, as scientists, we tend to be compartmentalized in thinking about our own little backyard. But when we're looking at a sort of a regional area of the world, such as Europe, for example, it seems pretty obvious that you're going to have regional differences in terms of linguistics, in terms of environment, and that's going to have an influence on the material culture that we're looking at, and it does make sense. So, for example, in the link that I was looking at the other day, we're looking at maybe 9 regional areas of Paleolithic Europe, which were the homes for Homo sapiens sapiens, like us, and also Neanderthals, our cousins. And there would have been obviously some form of influence from both cultures in certain regions of that European of the European mainland. So it's an obvious thing, but we don't really think much about it. And again, looking at the material culture, and again, the big problem we have, obviously, with the material culture, when we think about it, when we got our archaeological head on, we're looking at maybe 3 or 4% of the total material culture from any one site. We are scratching around literally in the dirt for those lithics, and for, if we're very very lucky, the rock art, the portable art, and that'll give us some clue about what we are looking at in terms of a cultural society. And so scientists have now put together this idea that we have 9 distinct regions, and a big green thumbs up for that, because I think it's something we tend to ignore, as like I said before. So I think it's quite important that we now identify where these sites, where these areas are, and I can actually think about over half of where these areas are, uh, prior to looking at the report on it. But the obvious areas are obviously Cantabria in Spain, southern Spain, uh, southwestern France, and the Dordogne area. And I would like to think that we have the northern frontier, which I've been talking about over the last couple of podcasts, in northwestern Europe, i.e., the British Isles. That wasn't the British Isles at the time, because it was connected to the continental mainland of Europe. And so there's 4 for a start. We've got Belgium, the Low Countries, Italy. So we are building up some interesting things, and and again, we can't prove it, of course, because it's such a long time ago.
Right.
But
Right.
I'll be interested to look at the linguistics aspect of that, and I'm sure there probably is. We can work out the linguistic aspects by looking at the changes in the regionality of the rock art, for example. And again, just one very good example is that if you go down to the Dordogne, and you were there 15,000 years ago during the Magdalenian, you got these beautiful uh, uh, animals being painted, such as bison, such as horse, uh, elk, reindeer, etc., on places like Lascaux, for example. You then go 400 or 500 kilometers to the north, to the northern frontiers of Paleolithic Europe at the same time, and you have a completely different type of artistic endeavor. And that type of regionality tells us that they're thinking about the same sort of animal, but in slightly different ways. In the way that in, say, for example, in Creswell Crags, which is in my part of the world. Creswell Crags is an area of 9 caves, 3 of them which are decorated with Paleolithic art, and in one of the caves, Churchhold Cave, we have the outlines of a bison. We have a red deer, a very nice red deer, in fact, realistic, representative, but completely uh, portrayed in a very different way to what we would be seeing in the caves of the Dordogne and Cantabria at that time. So, quite clearly, just by looking at the physical evidence, we've got 2 or maybe 3 very distinct areas of Europe already that we can start to think about the idea of regional change and regional identity. And I think that's the big key word. The word of identity is very very important. Where we're all modern humans, but we're doing things in a slightly different idiosyncratic way, and that is based on the environment, based on the lineage and how society is operated, and also what we're producing in terms of material culture.
And I think those are all extraordinarily good points because I think a lot of the time, and this is, due to just how we have viewed the past up till now, is that, oh, Ice Age people, that's it. That's all that there was. They were all the same. Whereas, when they start getting into the Americas, then before we had the Clovis, we had this and that, this sort of started differentiating. But as far as like Ice Age Europe went, for so long in the public eye, I mean, of course, we had like Mousterian, all those things. But in the public's eye, it was really just Neanderthals, and then modern humans came, and all modern humans were exactly the same.
Yeah, and I would argue within these sort of textbooks. If I was a student studying 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that's the thing that I would expect to be sort of given to me by a professor. That we are looking at, a hominin genus, but not we're not looking at thinking about regionality, and that is an interesting point to consider. I think, in some respects, Paul Barn touched on it when he worked with a guy called Vatut, who was a photographer, and they did a very good book called "Images of the Ice Age" back in the 1980s,
Mm.
and there they identified quite clearly, and I don't think it was deliberate. I think it was accidental. But they identified these so-called core areas of Europe where art was being found. They were the obvious areas, and there was about 4 or 5 different areas of Europe, including Cantabria in Spain um, and southwestern France. However, what was missing was what was going on in southern Spain. And this is really the first point of contact, really, in many respects, when you have that movement of people moving from the African continent across a landmass or a laked landscape across the Straits of Gibraltar into southern Spain. This is the first contact you're going to be getting with Neanderthals and maybe other waves of earlier human occupation as well. Now, the reason why I say that now is because, again, 10 or 15 years ago, we always considered there was just one wave of human movement through Europe,
Right.
into Europe from Africa, and that's clearly not the case. I mean, every year, as you well know, Seth, you pick up the press, and the press say, "Oh, we've got modern humans here now roaming around in Europe at 30,000, 32,000, 35,000, now 40,000." So quite clearly, there are a number of waves of human expansion, modern human expansion, coming from the south into Europe, and this is where it gets really interesting, very, very complex. And again, this is where I like this idea about regionality, regional identity.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've known, well, I won't say for a while because even today we struggle with the idea that biologically races don't exist, but they are regional adaptations. So why wouldn't there be cultural regional quote adaptations if we have
Yes, yeah,
physical
yeah.
adaptations? It just makes perfect sense. Um, and I think, they've identified it was 9, you said?
Sorry,
This,
nine. Yeah, nine regional areas of Europe
I
where you've
think
got.
that's, the beginning. I you
Yes,
know
it's a start. Yeah, yeah,
When you look at, the United States, North America, and you look at how many indigenous cultures there were
yeah,
pre-Columbus, it was in the thousands.
yeah, yeah.
So I would expect as we continue to look into this and we continue to divide items and archaeological, finds, we this number will grow much larger than 9,
Oh goodness me, yeah, I would say so. Yeah, yeah. I think even in the British Isles, we've now got 3 clear areas where Paleolithic art is being produced. Again, very difficult to date because it doesn't have the vibrancy and the artistic endeavour that we see down in southern France or in Spain, but it's there nonetheless. It's what I would term as a different type of Paleolithic because it's that northern frontier, and again, it's governed by climate, environment, and also Also, I dare say things like contacting and exchange, for example. You could be having, groups which are completely isolated because of the environment that these groups are living in northwestern Europe. But nonetheless, I would say that there is definitely a different identity in terms of the artistic endeavor and style being used in caves and rock shelters, between the three areas that I've been studying, certainly over the last 5 years. So, as you say, it can be further broken down, and this is what archaeologists love and anthropologists love, like compartmentalizing things into into areas where there's different characteristics, different identities, and this is what we're picking up.
Exactly, and I think we're definitely on a good start, as we've
Yeah,
said.
yeah, yeah. And
Definitely.
as you say as well, I think we haven't even started to explore the Americas yet. I and I think, as you say, there's probably many. Well, I tell you what, an interesting story, and the interesting story is that I think there's around about 380, 400 different languages in North America in terms of indigenous populations, who are historically known about, and also who survive, sadly, who survive and I mean this in a positive sense for these people who survive the persecutions of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Um, and one by one, those languages have disappeared in one respect, but still survive as an anthropological within the anthropological record. So if you've got 300 or 400 different languages, you've got then 300 or 400 different identities of people who
Right.
who who tattoo themselves in a particular way, who decorate themselves in a particular way, who have ceremonies in a different way, who produce rock art and portable art in a different way, and these are can be determined and looked at within the archaeological and the anthropological record by looking at the artistic endeavor that they are producing. And that's, again, another important point to consider when we're looking at this idea of regional identity.
Absolutely. Um, and again, regional identity can also just mean so many different things. It could just be a change in a belief in one god versus another in that
Yeah,
development. Or, I mean, culture is such an adaptive idea that it's really so hard to pin down what is separate from something else. And like something that Genevieve likes to say is we're trying to rebuild the past as a picture, as if we're looking into a room through a keyhole for a second, and then we have to rebuild the whole room.
mm,
I,
yeah,
we only have such minimal information, and we're trying to reconstruct whole cultures. I mean, look how many cultures we have today. It's mind-boggling
mm,
about how much we've lost about
yeah.
our own.
Well, this has been a problem with archaeology. Certainly, when I was an undergraduate, and I was fortunate, very fortunate in many respects, in that with anthropology and archaeology, you tend to think that these are separate subjects, but they're
Right.
not. I mean, as an archaeologist, I rely on geography, philosophy, sociology, you name it. I have to rely on it to bring in those ideas, the ideology and the intellectual properties of those ideas together in order to form a narrative. So, for example, if I'm looking at a Paleolithic site where there's only 4% of the total material culture available to me, i.e., lithics, a little bit of environmental evidence, a little bit of paleo-environmental evidence in terms of the natural environment, maybe the odd hearth, maybe a little bit of rock art. Um, what do I say about the remaining 96% that I don't have the answers for? So when Genevieve talks about the idea about looking through a keyhole, and then suddenly that keyhole is then blocked, and then you have to construct that story, that narrative, accurately with a degree of accuracy without being too foolish, then it becomes a very difficult thing to think about. And I was very fortunate, again, just timing because of where I came from. But in the 1980s, and this probably you're far too young to know this, Seth, but I was part of a group of people within British universities that studied a thing called social theory and archaeology. So basically, we were looking for answers through philosophy and sociology and anthropology to try and make more sense or more a meaningful past, which we couldn't do with just archaeology alone. We couldn't just dig a hole, record what was there, and then start painting a picture of what the past represented. We needed those other things, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, ethnography, in order to try and construct a meaningful past. And in many respects, even though now I would say if you are an undergraduate doing archaeology or even anthropology, the the idea of social theory is a shudder through any student's mind because it's going right beyond the practical into the hypothetical. Um, then you have to, but I consider the use of social theory at the time then and also now as a fundamental part of trying to make some sense of the past. Because I would say, I mean, I've heard so many archaeologists say that they have the answer. Yeah, we have the answer to Stonehenge, for example.
Right.
You don't have the you don't have the answer to Stonehenge at
I
all.
I
You know,
hear that about every 2 months, and it's a different answer. So,
yeah, yeah. I've just done a proposal to do some work in Stonehenge, in fact. And what I've worked out that for every 100 years, you've got 4 generations of community. So me, my dad, my grandfather, and my great grandfather, that represents 100 years. You
oh,
times that by the time between now, 2024, and when Stonehenge was in use 4,000 years ago, we're talking about 160 to 180 generations of community. That's a
right.
lot of people. And the thing is that you know as well as I do that if I was to ask my grandfather if he was still alive, or my great grandfather if he was still alive, what he could tell us about his history or their history, it would be fragmented. It'd be a very much a fragmented story. And as you go further back in time, that narrative that you see in real time is lost. And so to try and say you've got the answers to understanding, for example, for what we're talking about, regional identity of the Paleolithic, is very, very difficult indeed. We're looking at a very, very fragmentary evidence. There's no one there from 20,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago to say, hey, George, hey, Seth, this is what's going on. We don't know. So we don't have the answers. We don't have all the answers. We can only make sort of, very, very wild interpretations about what's going on. But we do need that hard evidence to try and support that. And again, that's just common sense in the way we handle ourselves in the scientific community. But again, that we have to rely on, in terms of archaeology, in my view, we have to rely on other disciplines to try and make the past meaningful and also
Absolutely.
and also interesting as well.
And I just that brings up 2 points that I wanna make. And one, I feel that anthropology and archaeology and really, a lot of the humanities are some of the most interdisciplinary fields that there are because they have to be.
Yeah,
Look at Rising Star and the team that Lee has built. He has experts from almost every different type of anything involving the landscape, human history, archaeology, bioarchaeology, because he knows he doesn't know everything. I can say that about him at least. He doesn't go around saying he knows everything. He brings in the people who do because he knows he doesn't. And that's how you need to approach these types of things. And the second thing, if I can remember what it was, um, is that, um, let's see, where were we? What were you just talking about, good sir, before I brought this up?
we were talking about regional identity, but I will add with Rising Star, and I think it's actually important one to think about, is that uh, Lee has obviously he's a very bold um, anthropologist who
Yes,
likes to who likes to entertain. He's very very good at
yes,
producing a good narrative, a good story.
the storyteller.
Uh, but and to support him in many ways, and I think this is sometimes very very helpful. He's had a lot of criticism, as we both know, and some of that criticism, in some respects, is relying on very very shaky ground indeed. And again,
Yeah.
that's important as well because then you can counter argue. This is the importance about about moving the meaning, the story, the narrative, and colouring the past in many respects with something we can all look at and appreciate. Um, is the idea of argument and counter argument, and this is what we're seeing a lot now with the particular Rising Star project. In that, there's a lot of people come out against him, but also there's a lot of people up there to support him as well. So the discussions are going, which I think is really, really good and very healthy for a scientific discipline such as anthropology.
Yes, we need the discussion, we need the back and forth, we need the dialogue, or we're not going to move. I have a saying, and that is stagnation is death. And I think that applies in every field and aspect of life. If you stagnate, if you stop, if you don't change, if you stop moving, life stops in one way or another. Now, the thing that I remembered was I think this would be an interesting time to kind of bring up and define something for our listeners who may not know. All of human history is 6,000 years old, correct? Because history is what is written. Prehistory is all of human history before we had written language. Quote unquote, the definition of history is what was written down. Am I right?
In one respect, yes. Yeah,
So when we talk about human history in general, we are talking about like 7 million years. But when
yeah,
we're talking about when other people are talking about history, they're more talking about, like, for example, when you were saying we have nothing to build on upon for history. Well, in my mind, I was thinking of I just learned about it in one of my classes. I don't remember which city in Egypt. It was, I think, Old Kingdom.
Luxor.
It might have been, but they had written records of everything they did. I
Yeah,
mean, how much the grain was, how many bowls of whatever they ate that day. We have
yeah.
a picture of their day-to-day life because they were so interested and well educated in writing it down. But that's not prehistory. Archaeologists working with human origins and Neanderthals, we don't have that.
Mm.
We have bones. We have dirt now that has DNA and proteins in it. We have lithics. Um, it's a different world when you're talking about history versus prehistory.
Yeah, yeah. There's an interesting concept to think about, Seth. In fact, and again, it's something which I've been looking at recently. I'm dealing with some rock art in South Wales, and the rock art is the humble cut mark. Now, for your listeners who don't know what the humble cut mark is, it's basically you have a soft rock such as sandstone or limestone, but mainly sandstone in certainly in the British Isles, and you get a harder rock. You gouge back and forth, left and right, or clockwise, anti-clockwise, and you create this cup, this gouge mark into the rock. And it we've got now about 170 odd sites just within Western Britain alone that has cut marks on these rocks. They could be on a burial monument, or they um, could be on the natural rock outcropping you see across a mountainous area of such as Western Britain. Now, what is really interesting about the cut mark, the humble cut mark, as I call it, it was flourishing. It was being put onto rocks between say 4000 BC and maybe to around about 1500 BC. So around about 2,500 years of application in northwestern Europe. And what is interesting is if you start to widen that distribution outwards, you've got it in Wales, you've got it in Ireland, you've got it in the Isle of Man, which is a small island between Isle of Man and Wales. You've got a lot of it in Scotland, southern England, and then let's go further. Southern Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany. Let's go south. France, Spain, Portugal, Morocco, and also in the basin of the Mediterranean, such as Malta, Crete, etc., etc. So clearly, there is between certainly if we look at the Atlantic facade, which runs from Portugal right through to Scandinavia, which is 3,200 kilometers, we have this little simple mark, either as a single cut mark or multiple cut marks being arranged in a particular way which has meaning, as they wouldn't do it. And the point is, the question I would ask is there any difference in terms of the linguistic and semiotic values of that cut mark in Spain and Portugal to what we're seeing in Scandinavia over that 3,200-kilometer stretch of landscape? And it probably isn't. They mean the same sort of things. And it's a bit like Christianity. When you see the cross we see right across the world now, spread Christianity along with Islam, along with many other world religions, has spread across the world. And we know what the crescent means, we know what the cross means, and that has a meaning. It's a very, very simple thing to do. I can produce a cross in a few seconds just by getting a pen and going 2 lines. There's your
Right.
cross. And we know from that very simple design that there is a very complex story involved. It involves the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, for example. Now, what does that cut mark mean in prehistory? And this is very, very interesting indeed. And again, some things, that it's so simple in terms of the of producing that cut mark, which maybe if you're looking at a hard rock, it may take half an hour to do a cut mark. But usually, if you're working in sandstone, it takes about 10 or 15 minutes with a harder stone to gouge that cut mark onto the rock. What do those cut marks mean? Are we looking at a complex story associated with a very simple mark? And probably the answer is yes. And so this is another interesting point. You say about the idea about the Egyptians, recording everything. That's history. I agree. But also, you can also be a bit pedantic. No, not pedantic. What's the word I'm looking for? You'll be a bit more free with your ideas about suggesting that the cut mark, the humble cut mark, which is the series of marks or motifs which people like Genevieve was looking at, that we see on megalithic monuments and Bronze Age monuments throughout Europe and the rest of the world, of course, I hasten to add. And in many respects, we've got a similar sort of situation where I think that people before written history are producing pictorial history, but that pictorial history has meaning to it. And that's the most important thing we must consider. And if we want to go back even further, I mean, just think about the geometric signs that Genevieve was looking at for the Paleolithic. And again, there's some intricacies there which hide behind very, very simple designs. Things like squares, triangles, rectangles, hash designs, for example. They're not just being slapped up for art's sake. There's something quite complex going on. And I would argue, this is my big thing, I would say the more simpler the mark, the more complex the story behind it. That's my one-liner for today.
And that goes into what we've been talking about a lot of we are viewing ancient people from how we live our lives and how we think today. So, you know, they are making we think of writing, we communicate with writing in our different languages or, even in sign language or whatever. And ancient peoples may have, as you said, used simple marks to tell complex stories that they understood that we just simply can't because we are not from that period. We
Yeah,
just don't understand how to perceive it properly because we are viewing it from a different worldview.
exactly.
So that
Yeah.
makes perfect sense.
And if we go forward now 20,000 years, so me and you are going to be reborn in 20,000 years' time, and we're doing an archaeological site, and we come across this fantastic building, right? And outside that fantastic building, there's a big post hole, and to the side of it is a big golden M. Okay, beautiful yellow, the paint still survives on it. So we've done analysis on it. What does it mean?
Right.
Now we know what it means now today, but what does it mean to an archaeologist or an anthropologist in 20,000 years' time if the archaeological record or the written records aren't there? What does that golden M mean with that building? Oh, well, also we've got coprolites, and in those coprolites we can see that beef burgers have been eaten. So
Just off the top of my head, going where anthropologists at least used to go, thinking everything was ritualistic versus utilitarian, it was a
yeah,
shrine to God, obviously.
of course it was.
What else would it be? What else would it be?
It's a shrine for good culinary Scottish cuisine. in the film of McDonald's. Yeah. So it is a very interesting questions, and like I say, my big one-liner for today is the more simpler design, the more complex the narrative there is behind it. We don't know what that narrative is, but I would suggest that it probably is complex when we think about the idea of the Christian cross, for example, or that crescent, the Islamic crescent, for example.
Right. I mean, there's so much history that they tell just in those simple marks. I
Exactly.
mean, it's yeah,
Yeah.
it's incredible.
Well, you
Um,
could well, you could build on the crescent, the whole of the Quran on that, and on the
right.
cross you could put in the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Bible in there as well.
Yeah.
That's complex in itself.
You could put in half of today's politics in behind the cross as well.
Oh yeah, oh yes, yeah. In certain
So I
countries,
mean, yeah, it's very symbols are so critical to being human, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah.
And
What?
yeah,
Sorry, Seth. I was interrupting you. Sorry. Go on. Go ahead.
and we just are beginning to understand what they mean. We can barely understand what Viking runes mean, and that was 2,000, 3,000 years ago. They
Mm.
just found the oldest example of runes, I think, in I don't remember where it was. I think it was Sweden.
It would be that'd be the obvious place to look. Yeah,
Yeah,
fucking
and I
sweet.
think it was like 3,500 years ago. And I
Yeah,
mean, that's nothing compared to the 35,000-year-old geometric signs that are in some caves.
yeah,
So there's so much to understand about our own cognition and our own history from what we have created. We have a record. We just need to learn how to read it.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Well, slowly but surely we are. If you just follow the news like we do, there are these little nuggets, golden nuggets of interpretation that comes out from some of the work that's been done in caves, rock shelters, and on open archaeological sites, which are starting to sort of give us some idea, another little piece in the jigsaw to try and understand what is going on with human history or human histories.
Right. And with that, I think we will switch to our next story.
Yeah,
Is a story that was in the news. It is about it's not necessarily something new that was discovered, but something that was previously known that we now have reassigned a purpose to.
yeah,
So, um, there was this tool that was created out of mammoth bones, mammoth tusk, in Holofells 35,000 years ago that was found in pieces. Once it was put back together and what they thought it was about 8 inches long. It kind of looked like a cudgel a bit, and they thought it was a ritualistic tool, a tool for some sort of who knows? It was just a ritualistic tool because, as we just mentioned, everything prior to a certain point was ritualistic in meaning and had no other origin or tendency. um, or it was artistic, but it turns out that it might actually have a utilitarian use. And what this is it is again, it's about 8 inches long and it has holes in it, about a few inches apart. And what they believe it was used for was to actually make rope. And if you think about it, rope is extremely important. What you can do with it, how useful it is, the many different things we can use rope for. And it was so effective that a team of 5 people could make I believe it was something like a 6 foot rope that was extremely flexible and strong out of cattail reeds, which was the best material that they found to use, in 10 minutes, which is remarkably fast for producing a textile in pre-industrial age. And while this might not seem like it's a big story, reanalyzing things that we thought had completely different meanings really gives us a better understanding of life back in the period we're discussing. If we look at all these items and we think they're all art or all ritualistic, we don't understand the day-to-day life, which is really what archaeologists, as far as I'm aware, are trying to really reconstruct. Because the ritualistic things, those are big and kind of obvious, you know. It's the day to day, the how they live their lives, the what happened when they woke up in the morning to when they went to bed, and learning these things, even if it's just how they made something, can give us so much insight into their lives. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yes, more than likely, what you've just said is what is probably going on. Again, we have a big problem with trying to. I mean, the story I'm going to be telling in a minute is even more sort of. Well, it's not as fantastical as what you've just been talking about. But what is interesting is again, it's just there is probably more than one interpretation you can add to the narrative by the people who have been doing the work. And again, this is the problem I have myself in that sometimes you get too close to the subject matter that you're looking at, and you tend to, with blinkers, tend to go off on a tangent and think, "I've got the answer. This is the answer." So yeah, so it is a bit of a problem, I think. And forgive me, correct me if I'm wrong, Seth. That the ivory that you were looking at was drilled, wasn't it? Drilled with a series of
Yes.
linear holes. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And again, I'm always a bit worried there because you've got the artifact, but not the rope, for example, that survives the archaeological record. And that again, that's a problem. So you again are thinking about probably the most obvious, but probably isn't the most obvious.
Now, what they did though was they did a residue analysis on the holes,
Yeah,
and they know that plant matter was passing through it quite
yeah,
often. So that's kind of where the idea that it was used to make ropes came from.
yeah. Did they identify the species of the plant by any chance they were looking at?
They did find cattail that was in
Right.
it, and when they did their experiments, they found that that was the most effective. So they
Yeah,
think while they may have used other materials or tried other materials, cattail, which for those who don't know, is that long, tall green plant with the kind of hot dog looking, it looks like a cat's tail, but whatever.
yeah, yeah.
Um, they would
Like a
use,
bulrush.
yes,
Yeah,
um, they would use that to make the material that they were making. Of
yeah.
course, as we were talking about when we're trying to rebuild the past, there's so many things that can go wrong and so many things that we can misinterpret. But I think the idea that we're moving away from everything had to be ritualistic is a good idea.
I think so, you're probably right. Yeah, I mean it's too easy, and I've fallen into that trap myself of thinking that when you're looking at something complex within a fragmentary archaeological record, the easiest way out to say it's ritual, it's symbolic, and probably it's not. It's probably quite simple in terms of utilitarian tools and items used by people in their day to day worlds.
Right.
Which brings me on to my one of my which brings me on to one of my things I'm going to bring up this week, and it's radiocarbon dating on a area of the world, Borneo, which is in obviously Southeast Asia, and they've been looking at historical art for once. So the historical art is 17th and 18th century, and with it, the rock art is basically suggests that we're looking at indigenous resistance. So basically, uh, the art is suggesting that there is conflict between probably neighbouring groups, more than likely. And again, it's an obvious thing to think about because, again, I remember dealing with the rock art from Gasula Gorge down in southeastern Spain many years ago, where you have really that's the only area of my part of the world where you see clear indication of resistance, indigenous resistance against other groups in the form of skirmishing between different tribal groups. And you've got bows and arrows, you've got people being executed, people who are being injured and maimed. And again, it's another story we need to get into, probably not today because it's such a vast area. But what was quite interesting was that this report was in a very good online journal called PLOS One. That's PLOS plus one for listeners who have not come across this before. It's a very good peer reviewed journal,
Yes.
and the people who have been looking at it as an Australian academic group who've been looking at this site um, in Borneo. It's part of it's the Malaysian part of Borneo, and the cave is called Gura Saya. And Gura Saya is a big cave system with not just historical rock art in it, but also prehistoric art as well. And again, what they're trying to suggest here that the imagery that they're seeing here, which is, like I said before, 17th and 18th and 19th century in date, so it's not that old, but there are a lot of parallels which you could actually transfer from the historical past to the prehistoric past. And I think what they're talking about there, which is really interesting, is this idea that there is some form of misunderstanding, you could say, between neighbouring groups. And again, if you look at the anthropological record, and I dare say you can highlight this, Seth, um, you are going to get if you've got territories and territoriality, and you've got food resources which are being reduced by the generation because obviously the tribal group community or territory that you're in is getting bigger in population, but the territory is staying the same. There's going to be conflict.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and so right now I have gotten onto a rock art project. I am quite, I'm quite happy and proud of myself for that. It's a study on a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Tanzania called Kondwa, and
Yeah.
I'm talking about it a lot because it's pretty cool. Um, and one of the big issues is who's responsible for the art, because there's been a lot of populations and groups that have been in the area over the last few thousand years. And there's, like you mentioned, there's been clashes between groups, there's been replacement, there's been dispersals, there's been remigrations. And so finding who's responsible for the art is important because it aligns the culture and cultural understandings with who made the art, and that might tell us what the art means. And so it's very interesting when you have so many different people in one area making rock art and what we can learn about their different cultures simply about the different way they make strokes in the paint. I mean,
Mm.
it's astonishing. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well, which listeners may be interested in, it's a really good reference, in fact. But I used a reference going back, I think it's 1988, by a guy called Yesner. That's Yesner, Yesner. And Yesner pulled up, I think, around about 12 or 14 points of why societies go into conflict. And they're very good sort of bullet point reasons why. It could be the idea of increased population, reduced activity in hunting, fishing, and gathering, for example, if you're dealing with hunter, fisher, gatherers societies. But it's well worth a read and a look at. I use that a lot. I used it a lot when we were thinking about the idea about how societies define territory or territoriality. And and I say, there's been very few um, researchers looking into this particular area. A bit like, I suppose, our regionality in the Paleolithic, which has just come out as a paper. So again, it's just an interesting thing to think about, this idea of why do people fall into conflict, and there's again numerous reasons. And the two things I remember when I was an undergraduate doing anthropology was the Yanomara in Brazil, and the way they dealt with the gene pool, for example, where they needed fresh individuals, obviously women, to to increase and secure the tribal group, and also cattle rustling in Kenya by the Masamare, sorry, who obviously needed cattle, and they would do cattle raids. And what was interesting about that was that, again, just remembering off the top of my head, but
Right.
when they went into conflict, when neighbouring groups got into conflict, they weren't out to kill each other; they're only there to maim. So you get a stabbing in the ankle, a stabbing in the calf, the back of your legs, if you were in conflict. But there was the golden rule was you weren't allowed to kill anybody. You just gave them a bit of a fresh warning that you're in my territory, get out of it. And so that's how the warring sorry, that's how disputes were settled. And we also see it within Irajara in Papua New Guinea as well, in the Hagen Mountains, whereby they maim, but they don't kill. And I think this is what my interpretation of the plus one article written by the Australian team working in Borneo within the cave, looking at the rock art there. I think a similar sort of thing is going on. I think it's aggression, but it's mild aggression rather than full aggression. But then, who knows?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much that we don't know that we still have to
Yeah,
figure out. So much
exactly.
ethnography that we have to do. So much. I mean, and again, that's where the interdisciplinary comes from, even within anthropology, because for those of you who don't know, and this means at least in California, because I don't know how it is anywhere else, but when you take any anthropology class in California, they drill into you that there are four subfields of anthropology: biological, linguistic, cultural, and archaeology. That's how it's defined, at least in California. And so, even within anthropology, you have to be interdisciplinary. For instance, I have a degree in cultural anthropology, and I'm working on my degree at ASU in biological anthropology so I can have a better understanding of what makes us human, because they are both equally, along with other aspects, important in creating what makes you and I. There's no such
Yeah,
thing as just boom, here's a human that's fully developed, there's a normal, and that's what it is. And I think, you know, it's really important for us to start to understand that.
yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you that on that front. And again, let's again. You're sort of highlighting what we've already been talking about. This idea of of cross of cross interdisciplinary research in order to get some of the answers to what we're looking for.
Right, right,
And yeah, I mean, and again, just one little MB note. I'm working on a site now in South Wales, which we got rock art there. It's Paleolithic. We know it's Paleolithic, but I've had to rely on maybe 4 or 5 different disciplines to try and prove that. Not just dating experts, but also people looking at style, for example, looking at pigment analysis. So you're looking for chemistry, you're looking for dating experts, you're looking for rock art experts. You're also looking for people like myself who looks at maybe a more theoretical humanity approach to understanding the rock art.
right. Absolutely. All right. So I think we will now transition to Northern Europe
You-
45,000 years ago.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Let's get in our time machine and go that.
Fossils have been found near a cave near the town of Rennes in eastern Germany, and the genetic analysis of these fossils suggests that they have markers of distinct and anatomical modern humans. They had leaf-shaped stone tools that they once believed were crafted by Neanderthals, and the heavily built hominins lived there 40,000 years ago. Now, we do not, as far as I know, and from many of my studies, we do not have a date, well, a good date, for when AMH, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, or some people like to say Homo sapiens sapiens, entered Europe. It has changed quite drastically, just as it has done with entering the Americas. I know. So this site, they're talking about 45,000 years ago, and they're saying that this extends when modern humans were in Europe. However, I recall a paper a few months ago that they had found evidence of, I believe, oh, like it was a modern human weapon technology in France 55,000 years ago. So I'm
Mm,
not sure exactly where this news article is coming from when it says that modern human dates had been pushed back, because I believe we already had sites that were older than 45,000 years. But the idea behind this article, and the reason that I wanted to bring it up, is the time span in which modern humans and Neanderthals and their comorbidity, their coexistence on the same terrain, seems to be expanding. At first, we didn't think there was any interaction. Then we realized they bred. Then we thought we made them go extinct. We thought we've done so many different things to Neanderthals. But now we're realizing we lived with them for at least 10,000 years, which
mm,
gives so much time for cross cultural, or excuse me, for, crossing cultural information, learning things from one another,
yeah,
passing genetics in between one another. 10,000 years is a very long time in modern human history. We've only been around for 300,000, and that's not even anatomically modern humans. That's just Homo sapiens.
yeah.
So to have been living with Neanderthals, to be living with another human species, and I'm right now reading The Naked Neanderthal by Ludovich. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I've mixed ideas on it so far. It's interesting, but he does point out we can't understand Neanderthals without really being where they've been. And it turns out, for part of our history, humans and Neanderthals were with each other. And so I think it is built into us that we already do know something about what it means to be a Neanderthal, because we were with them. We don't culturally remember now, but we traded ideas. We traded more than just genes with them, I feel. And the longer we lived with them in Europe, the longer those ideas would have passed. I mean, we even see cultural transmission between chimpanzees and other great apes. So to think that Neanderthals and modern humans lived on the same area for at least 10,000 years and did not have cultural transmission, to me, is ridiculous. How could that not happen? I
I
mean,
totally agree with you. I mean, what's interesting is here, Seth, and this is actually a question I raised this week, in fact. But I wonder how much, if we assume that we are the so-called superior genus, Homo, us, anatomically modern humans, and we come into an area of the world, i.e., northwestern Europe, or not, sorry, Europe per se, within the range of Neanderthals. Um, the one thing which I think is interesting is this argument, and this is the argument I would put to students. Um, are we coming into this area of Europe, where where I live at the moment, and the range of Neanderthals? Are we mimicking rock art which has been produced by Neanderthals, or are Neanderthals mimicking art made by modern humans?
yeah.
And this is a really interesting point. Or is there some sort of grey area where we've got a hybrid um, um, sort of cultural revolution going on, whereby they're learning off each other how to produce art and what they're trying to say. Let's assume that that art is not art; it's some form of communication system, and it's associated with death, burial, and ritual, and also the idea of sanctity and shrine in these caves. Because surprise, surprise, nearly all the stuff we're seeing, which has been made by early modern humans, and we now have pretty good evidence now for Neanderthals working in sort of producing art in certainly southwestern Europe, Um, they're all in the same sort of place. So I'm wondering if there's some sort of cross fertilization of ideas between modern humans and Neanderthals. And let's face it, there's got to be some form of cross fertilization, forgive the pun, because we've got Neanderthal DNA in us. So
Right.
we're part of that hybrid that's coming out of Europe, and then and obviously yeah, out of Europe and colonizing the world. In some places like China, for example, the percentage of DNA which is Neanderthal is higher than anywhere else. So
Right.
you know, so there's something going on. And what is interesting is, and if I was to put a cutoff point, I would put a cutoff point around about 65,000 years. So far, and I dare say I'll be proved wrong in about 5 or 10 years' time, because there'll be somebody saying, "Hang on a minute, modern humans were not just exploding into the world and into Europe at 40,000, as I understood when I was an undergraduate, but
Right.
now we can put that. It's certainly in northern Israel, for example, where I've been working, where we've got 90,000 years for modern humans.
Right.
So it's a dynamic question which needs to be answered every 10 years. But quite clearly, I think that what we've got going on here is some form of cross fertilization, both culturally and obviously physically, between Neanderthals and early modern humans. And again, I I, I think that is an obvious thing that's probably going on. And as you say, you can't think of the idea of having this isolation between two different types, different species of hominin.
Absolutely. And I think even if you just do a basic analysis of modern human rock art in Africa before they left or on their way out, you know, we it hasn't preserved as well. There aren't caves like Lascaux that we have found. We have sand-blasted sandstone where we're now just discovering massive camels and gorgeous pieces of work that we're only just uncovering. And so modern humans, I believe, had that ability. But what you see from what I know is Neanderthals were making more markings. And then when we
Yeah.
see modern humans come in, all of a sudden their markings are now kind of more exaggerated, they're more dynamic. They're not doing things like Chauvet, but there's a change in the Neanderthal art. Maybe not so much in the modern human art, but I
Mm,
think you see the Neanderthal art kind of not advance, because what does advance mean when we're talking about two different human intelligences? But
mm,
it's different, I think. I think in some areas where we know modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted, we do see a difference in both of the art. And I think
mm,
you're 100% right on that.
mm. I think once again another interesting question for another podcast in some respects, Seth, is to think about the idea about for Chauvet, for example. Now, Chauvet, again, if the listeners don't know, it's a fantastic cave site discovered in 1994 by a cave called Chauvet in the Ardèche in southern France. And in it is most exquisite art on par with Lascaux and Altamira. And the question is, with this particular cave, it's had very extensive research done within it, and there's 120 radiocarbon dates, as far as I remember. Talking to Jean Clot, who's the guy who was the scientific advisor for this cave site, and he's got dates of art between 29,000 and 33,000 um, BC, and sorry, BCE. And what I'd be asking is, this is really high, sophisticated art, but I don't see a development before it. What's going on? Again, this is the question. I think it's something we should have a debate about at some point in the future, about this idea about where does high art come from? Because we are seeing, within the Neanderthal area, sorry, within caves where there's been Neanderthal activity and the potential, I say inverted commas, potential for Neanderthal rock art. These are very, very simple geometric signs. And if we look through prehistory, we do see this development of geometrics and simple designs being replaced by simple representative animals, which then become elaborate animals, then go back to geometrics, then to abstract, etc., etc. And you see this going all the way through, not just within Europe, but right across the world. And it seems to be And what you've got there is, a pattern emerging. But the question I would ask is, where is this high art coming from? Who had the idea at the time to produce elaborate cave art in paintings such as Chauvet? I can't use Lascaux because Lascaux's too recent, but
Right, right.
but Chauvet does give a 29 to 33,000 BC date range for some of the art that's been produced there. So where's it coming from? Who's developing that idea?
Exactly. Um, and that's a very good point because I mean, you're right. It is very simple, and then all of a sudden a we have panels of gorgeous art.
Yeah,
Uh, so you know what happened there? It's a very
yeah.
good question. Definitely will have to be on a different episode because that might be a whole episode on its own.
I think it. I think it
And
would.
maybe we could bring on some other people to discuss with us.
I could. I will ask Jean Claude, the main
That,
man, if he would come along and do it.
of course,
He's a very very approachable guy, and I'm sure he would come along and do a quick a chat with us, and he would
you've
give his
seen
views on it.
Cave of Dreams, right? The
Yeah,
Werner Herzog documentary.
that's right. Yes.
So one of my favorite all-time documentaries. I literally go to sleep to it. My my partner knows the first notes in the beginning and
Yeah.
rolls eyes because I've watched it so many times.
Yeah. Yeah.
I swear, if you got Jean Claude on this show, I don't even know what I would do. Um,
I shall drop him a line tonight, Seth. Just for you. Just for you. I'll drop him a line
uh,
tonight and see
that
if we
would
can get
be
him on.
no, that would be amazing. For our like you briefly mentioned for our guests who may not know him, he is the science director of Chauvet. He is in charge of everything going on at
Mm.
this stunning cave. And again, if you haven't seen it, Cave of Dreams, um, I'm not sure what it's on anymore. It used to
It,
be on.
it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube. You could probably get the link for it and put it on for our
Okay,
listeners to look at.
I will do that. Yeah, it is fantastic. You actually get to see the cave art. I mean, it is and getting permission to go into these caves and then permission with film equipment, I mean, it is like a once in a lifetime thing. So
Yeah.
we gotta see this. Um, all right. Well, is there anything else you wanted to discuss?
I'll stick with Chauvet for just one more thing I want to advertise as well. The Bradshaw Foundation, if you
Yes.
get a chance for listeners to go, type in Bradshaw Foundation as Google search. And on there, members of the RAN group, which is the Rock Art Network group, two Americans, I think, have done a fly through of Chauvet Cave. And it's quite a remarkable piece of animation and rendering, which is well worth looking at. And again, as you say, and as I've said already, we should devote a whole program, whole podcast on Chauvet. And like I say, if I can get Jean Claude, I will.
Absolutely. That would just be stunning. So, unless there's anything that you would further like to discuss, I think that kind of would be a good wrap up to this episode of the Paleo Post Podcast.
It's a wrap. It's a wrap.
All right. Well, guys, I I'm uncomfortable doing this. I don't like doing this, but all the other YouTubers do it and all the other people do it and they have a lot more views than me and so I'm going to do it. If you like it, and you want more, please subscribe. It's kind of awkward because we get a lot of viewers on these videos, but you guys need to subscribe so you get the new ones to keep us making more because we want to reach a larger group so we can educate more people, so we can spread that understanding. It's not about making money, it's not about putting our ideas down your throat. It is about expanding our understanding of human origins so we can make more intelligent decisions about our future and we can live happy, healthier lives. And the more people that know these things, the better off we're going to be. So, like, subscribe, share, do whatever you got to do. Just help us out. It changes the world, literally. All right, guys, that is it for us. This is Seth signing out, and we will see you next time.